On Monday, April 9, 1973, in West Beirut's Verdun neighborhood, the city is still awake, in the way coastal capitals stay awake: late dinners, taxi doors, radios behind shutters. Offshore, Israeli naval vessels sit beyond the visible line, and small inflatables begin to move in. What matters most in the first minutes is not gunfire, but appearance. Civilian clothes, a practiced walk, a hand that checks a sleeve the way a commuter checks a watch. Later press photographs will show the aftermath as public ritual coffins carried through Beirut, but the entry is quieter than the exit. Among the Commandos, some are disguised as women, a decision described in later interviews and official summaries as a way to pass as ordinary couples at night. In the mirror of a car window, a wig is adjusted like a domestic habit. The city does not react yet. It will. And when it does, the cost will be counted in names that were never meant to be spoken together. By late 1972, in Israeli political and security circles still shaped by the aftershock of the Munich massacre that September, retaliation had become a policy problem before it became a field problem. How to punish without widening a war, how to strike without admitting the shape of the strike. The campaign that followed would become known publicly as Operation Wrath of God, though the Beirut raid would be remembered for something more specific: its intimacy and its brazenness. Intelligence assessments, later described in reputable reporting, pointed to 3 senior Palestine Liberation Organization figures living close together in West Beirut's Verdun neighborhood: Mohammed Youssef al-Najjar, known as Abu Yusuf, a senior Fatah figure linked to Black September operations; Kamal Adwan, identified as the head of operations in the occupied territories; and Kamal Nasser, the PLO's official spokesman and a member of its executive committee. The names were not abstractions inside these files. They were intended to become addresses, doorways, stairwells. The logic was procedural. If targets could be located, the problem became insertion and extraction. But the moral logic remained unresolved, even in official retellings, because an address in a residential district is never only an address. This is where the cover was born. Not a single alias on a passport, but the broader disguise of normality. The domestic motif began before Beirut was even visible. Clothing was chosen not for comfort, but for plausibility. In later descriptions, this operation would be framed as a military raid supported by intelligence service logistics, a hybrid that blurred responsibility the way night blurs faces. The most unsettling part of the cover is that it asks participants to practice being ordinary until ordinary starts to feel like a role they cannot take off. By early 1973, the verified outline was simple. Mossad agents were positioned to support a military raid, and the target's residential area would be treated as both a neighborhood and a grid. Official and journalistic summaries agree on the core method. The raiders would be brought to shore, met by agents with vehicles, and driven into the city under civilian pretext. What cannot be responsibly embellished are the granular mechanics, exact apartments observed from which windows, which bystanders noticed what on which day, because sources do not consistently preserve those details at street level. What is documented, however, is that residents later described noticing unfamiliar people and photography around the buildings in the weeks before the raid, an echo of surveillance that only becomes obvious after it is too late to act on. Verdun, in the documented record, was not a combat zone. It was a residential district containing foreign families and local families, a place where the presence of outsiders was not inherently suspicious. That social fact was not incidental. It was operationally valuable. The cover did not need to be perfect if the neighborhood was trained by daily life to accept strangers. In later accounts, the preparation is often described with the language of professionalism, intelligence, delivered, routes planned, timing rehearsed. But the operational problem was not only technical, it was ethical. The more normal the neighborhood, the greater the moral burden of choosing it as a battlefield. That burden does not show up as confession in the record. It shows up as the need for speed. Get in, finish, leave before the city has time to become fully human in the mind of the raider. Surveillance is often described as patience. In a residential district, it becomes intrusion measured in centimeters. And once intrusion is measured, the only question left is how many minutes it will take. On Monday, April 9th, 1973, as departure approached, credible summaries and later interviews converged on a detail that has outlived much of the operational jargon. Some of the commandos were disguised as women and Ehud Barak. Then a young commander in Sayeret Matkal, the elite reconnaissance unit, was identified in multiple reputable accounts as among those entering Beirut in that disguise. The point was not theatricality, it was concealment by social expectation. Couples on a street read as private, and privacy is a kind of cover. A disguise is not only clothing, it is gait, posture, tempo. The most psychologically relevant fact is not that a wig was used, but that it had to be worn convincingly enough to hold up under streetlight, under proximity, under sudden attention. That kind of performance alters the performer. Sustained deception is corrosive by design. The operation was also framed by official summaries and reputable journalism as a joint logic. Military force for execution, intelligence service logistics for access and escape. Mossad support was described in practical terms, vehicles arranged, drivers in position. The city pre-handled, but the psychological meaning was different. The presence of civilian facilitators made the operation feel less like an incursion and more like an errand. That sensation is dangerous because it lowers the moral volume of the act. No reliable record requires invented dialogue here. The discipline was silent. The commands were minimal. The planning was compartmentalized. The men who would kick in doors were trained to move as if noise itself were a liability. And in a residential district, noise is also testimony. Appearance was checked one final time, not for vanity, but for survivability. At this stage, nothing had been done, and yet the cover had already taken something. The ability to be fully oneself without performing. The sea was waiting, and the city lights were still warm. Late on Monday, April 9th, 1973, the departure was documented in official and journalistic form as maritime. Forces left from Haifa, traveled by naval vessels, and approached Beirut for insertion using inflatable boats. Accounts describe Mossad agents already positioned to receive them onshore with vehicles leased or rented for the operation, an arrangement that made the first minutes on land feel almost civilian until the destination clarified what civilian was being used for. The sensory facts were operational constraints. Salt air that clings to fabric, engine noise that must be managed, sand that sticks to shoes and can betray where someone has been. In the most credible summaries, the raid was meant to be fast hours, not days, and the signature detail was simultaneity. While assassination squads moved toward Verdun, other teams were assigned additional targets in Beirut and near Sidon. It is here that the phrase "into the heart of Beirut" becomes literal in the most unsettling way. The Commandos did not arrive as an army. They arrived as fragments, small groups, moving under civilian mask, relying on the city's own tolerance for nightlife and couples and taxis. The cover was the first weapon and the first vulnerability. If the cover broke too early, the mission would expand into a firefight in streets filled with people who did not sign up for any of it. Official summaries later described the operation's duration as approximately 2.5 hours, a number that reads like efficiency until one remembers what those hours contained. In this moment offshore, the number was not yet history. It was a promise. The domestic motif tightened into something clinical. The wig was adjusted not as costume, but as equipment. The face was made ordinary the way a weapon is made ready. Before a shot was fired, the operation already depended on strangers behaving normally, and normality cannot be commanded, only borrowed. In the early hours of Tuesday, April 10th, 1973, the targets were documented not only as political figures but as residents. Mohammed Youssef al-Najjar, known as Abu Yusuf, was described in multiple sources as a senior Fatah and PLO figure, one of the founders of Black September, and reportedly connected to the Munich operations planning, though he denied direct involvement. Kamal Adwan was identified as chief of operations for activities in the occupied West Bank and Gaza. Kamal Nasser was identified as the PLO spokesman and a member of its leadership, a poet before he was a revolutionary, a voice before he became a target. Reputable reporting placed them in Verdun, living close enough that a coordinated strike could reach them in near synchrony. What must be handled with discipline is the boundary between target and environment. Verdun was not a remote camp. It was apartments, stairs, neighbors, and in documented aftermath accounts, the presence of civilians who became casualties. Al-Najjar's wife, Yusra, was reported killed in the raid. At least one civilian neighbor, an Italian woman named Elena Dawuk-Peri, was also reported killed when she responded to commotion outside her door. These are not narrative flourishes. They are the human proof of what it means to strike leadership at home. The target's world, in a strictly evidence-based telling, is defined more by role than by private habit. Sources do not reliably specify what each man ate for dinner that night. The dossier does not need those inventions. It has enough. The targets lived within a normal building rhythm, and that rhythm was exploited. A home is predictable in ways a headquarters is not. Both the raiders and the targets were using normal life as protective coloration, and the civilians living nearby were trapped inside that overlapping deception. When leadership is targeted in apartments, the operation inherits the apartment's moral geometry. Doors, families, neighbors, collateral by design. In later interviews and reconstructions, including accounts from people connected to Kamal Adwan's household, there were descriptions of uneasy observations in the weeks before the raid, unfamiliar activity near the buildings, people taking pictures, a sense that something was being measured. The core verified point is not the exact wording of these recollections. It is that surveillance sometimes leaves a residue that civilians can feel, and that residue becomes meaningful only once violence confirms it. By the night of April 9th into April 10th, Verdun's ambient soundscape, cars, voices, radios, helped conceal movement. The cover was not only clothing, it was timing. The idea that people were expected to be outside, expected to be moving, expected to be paired off. Reputable reporting describes the assault teams approaching in a way designed to look unremarkable, and that they were driven into Verdun by Mossad agents who had arranged the vehicles. This is also where moral context must be acknowledged without sermonizing. The raid was described as part of a retaliatory campaign tied to Munich. Yet the people who would first experience the raid were not policymakers. They were spouses, neighbors, night guards, and local police responding to gunfire in what they perceived as their jurisdiction. The domestic motif appears in a small, verifiable way. The disguise required attention to face and hair, and later accounts explicitly note wigs and makeup. Ehud Barak later spoke publicly about the experience, describing the practicality of appearing as a couple rather than a group of men moving through streets at night. The act was banal. The purpose was not. A person becomes a couple on the street. A couple becomes a mechanism for entry. Surveillance does not announce itself as danger. It announces itself as odd, and oddness is easy to ignore in a city used to strangers. Then doors break, and every ignored detail becomes a warning that arrives too late. Official summaries identify Emmanuel Shaked as the overall commander of the operation and situate Ehud Barak and Amnon Lipkin-Shahak among the commanders of forces involved. This matters not as trivia, but as structure. A raid like this was a sequence of delegated permissions. Each segment, naval movement, shore insertion, driving, entry, withdrawal, had its own leader, its own timing, its own capacity to fail. By Tuesday, April 10th, 1973, the mission's logic was fully committed. The decision to enter Verdun disguised as civilians depended on Mossad logistics. The decision to strike multiple targets in the same window depended on military coordination. The decision to withdraw rapidly depended on the city responding slowly. But cities do not promise slowness. They promise only the probability of chaos once violence becomes audible. The dossier voice must hold moral distance here. In Israeli accounts, the operation was framed as necessary retaliation. In Lebanese and Palestinian contexts, it was framed as violation and massacre in a residential district. Both framings can be documented, and neither can erase the other. The operation's outcome would include the killing of 3 senior PLO figures. It would also include civilian deaths and a public international reaction. Shortly after the raid, Lebanon would raise the matter at the United Nations, and on Saturday, April 21, 1973, the Security Council would adopt Resolution 332, condemning attacks on Lebanon. The operation did not end on the beach. It continued in diplomatic language, attempting to translate blood into jurisdiction. The domestic motif tightened into a final pre-entry ritual. The disguise was checked, corrected, made believable. The act resembled preparation for a night out. The purpose was to make killing possible at conversational distance. In an operation built on compartmentalization, responsibility was distributed so efficiently that it could feel like it disappeared, but the street would hold it. The morning would demand it back. On Tuesday, April 10, 1973, after midnight, credible summaries described the insurrection as amphibious. Forces approached Beirut by sea and reached shore via inflatable boats. What can be responsibly said is what multiple, reputable accounts agree on. The landing was coordinated so that raiders could step onto land already inside. A prepared logistical lane, vehicles and drivers arranged by Mossad, civilian disguises ready. Routes planned toward Verdun. The sensory anchors are operational facts. The hush when motors are reduced. The texture of wet sand that can ruin clothing. The streetlight glow that makes a costume either convincing or absurd. In some retellings, the Navy component is emphasized. In others, the intelligence component. The key is not which institution receives credit, but how the institutions fused. Military force delivered into a city by intelligence infrastructure. Where sources diverge on specifics, the dossier should not smooth divergence into certainty. The city heard movement. Later narratives argued about method. In reputable accounts, disguise is not anecdote, it is core tradecraft. Barak was repeatedly identified as entering the city disguised as a woman, and he later described the reason as reducing suspicion compared with a group of men moving together at night. The raiders had to look like private people, because private people are allowed to move without explanation. The domestic motif reached its most utilitarian form. The wig and makeup were no longer symbols. They were load-bearing components of the plan. The disguise was maintained in silence, in the back of a vehicle, with hands that must not tremble because tremor reads as attention. In the field, the most dangerous moment is often the most ordinary, walking, unhurried, as if the city belongs to the walker. And the closer the raiders got to the buildings, the more the cover started to feel like a second skin that could not be shed. In the early minutes of Tuesday, April 10, 1973, credible reconstructions describe assault teams splitting into squads and entering residential buildings on or near Verdun Street, where the 3 senior PLO figures lived close together. The operational sequence, in multiple reputable accounts, is consistent in essentials. Approach under civilian cover, rapid entry, doors forced open, targets shot, withdrawal before sustained response could fully organize. The confirmed dead among primary targets were Mohammed Youssef al-Najjar, Kamal Adwan, and Kamal Nasser. Reputable reporting and official summaries also report that al-Najjar's wife, Yusra, was killed in the raid, and that a civilian neighbor, Elena Daouk Perry, was killed amid the commotion. The dossier must hold these facts in the same frame because they occurred in the same buildings, under the same decisions. Some accounts describe the assault as lasting only minutes at the apartments, an intensity that matters psychologically. In open combat, distance can dilute responsibility. In a residential breach, responsibility is intimate. The act is close enough to hear breathing, close enough to see photographs on walls, close enough to feel the building's normal life pressing in from behind the target's door. A later journalistic account describes Lebanese police and guards responding and suffering fatalities as they attempted to react to the attack. The record does not need invented heroics. It has enough to state causality. Gunfire in Verdun brings response. Response brings exchange. Exchange increases casualties, and withdrawal must now move through a city that has begun to awaken. The domestic motif becomes grotesquely inverted. A disguise meant to look like private life has delivered the raider into a private space to end a life. The wig is still on. The makeup is still intact. The cost has already occurred. When squads came back down the stairs, the night had changed shape and the city was now listening. While assassinations unfolded in Verdun on April 10, 1973, verified summaries describe simultaneous actions against additional Palestinian targets in Beirut and near Sidon, including strikes on facilities associated with factions, such as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and Fatah infrastructure. Official descriptions note multiple targets and groups assigned to them, reflecting a broader operational aim. Not only decapitation, but disruption, destroying workshops, headquarters, and logistical nodes. This is where the raid's human cost becomes harder to compartmentalize, because secondary targets can generate prolonged resistance and unintended exposure. In reputable accounts centered on Amnon Lipkin-Shahak's role, a separate engagement during the raid resulted in Israeli casualties. Official and journalistic summaries agree on the essential fact: 2 Israeli soldiers were killed during the operation. Multiple sources identify them as Avida Shor and Hagai Ma'ayan, though transliteration varies across English renderings. Their deaths matter structurally because they demonstrate that the operation was not frictionless, insertion and exit. A raid can be planned down to minutes and still be forced into improvisation by a single, unexpected exchange of fire, a delayed vehicle, a faster police response than anticipated. The dossier should not invent the exact corner where a firefight flared or the exact words shouted. It should show what is verifiable. Resistance happened, and people died on both sides of the plan. Operationally, credible summaries emphasize that the raiders still withdrew successfully, and that broader mission objectives were achieved. Morally, the file cannot label that as closure. The city had now absorbed multiple explosions of violence, and the difference between target and battlefield had been erased by the fact that Beirut itself was used as the medium. In the report, secondary targets are listed like checkboxes. In the streets, they become the reason the night does not stay contained. When vehicles turned back toward the shoreline, the raid's success was already being rewritten by the dead. By the end of April 10, 1973, credible official summaries describe the raid as completed within roughly 2.5 hours, with forces withdrawing back to the coast and out to sea. Reputable reporting adds a consequential operational detail. The raiders took documents during the assault, and those documents were later described as enabling arrests or roll-ups of Palestinian operatives, particularly in the West Bank. Even here, the dossier must be careful. It can state that documents were taken and later described as valuable. It should not invent their precise contents. The withdrawal is often narrated in military terms: boats, timing, extraction. But the documentary voice must emphasize what withdrawal means in a city. The raiders leave, and the residents remain inside the broken environment. The physical evidence stayed behind: doors forced open, bullet holes, blood on stairs, details described by witnesses in later reporting. The domestic spaces, once ordinary, became crime scenes, without the legal closure that crime scenes usually imply. On the Israeli side, official summaries present achievement: 3 senior leaders killed, multiple sites struck, intelligence seized. On the Lebanese side, the same event was framed as violation of sovereignty and deadly incursion into a civilian neighborhood. Both framings are part of the verifiable public record, because both were argued in public and in international venues. The psychological cost to operatives is difficult to document without memoir or testimony. And the dossier must not invent it. Instead, it should use available evidence. Later interviews, in which commanders describe disguises, timing, and the purposeful choice to look like civilians in order to kill. The transformation can be shown through what is publicly said later, and what is left unsaid. The domestic motif returns as residue. The disguise must be removed, but the memory cannot be. Extraction ends the mission, but it does not end the scene. The scene continues living without the people who caused it. On Thursday, April 12, 1973, press photographs and reporting documented mass mourning in Beirut, with large funeral processions for the three slain leaders, al-Najjar, Adwan, and Nasser, and reputable reporting places their burial at the Martyrs' Cemetery used for Palestinian officials and fighters. The exact number of mourners varies by source, but the consistent, verifiable point is scale. This was not quiet death absorbed privately. It was public event that converted violence into political meaning. The aftermath also became institutional. Lebanon's protest reached the United Nations, and on Saturday, April 21, 1973, the Security Council adopted Resolution 332, condemning Israeli attacks on Lebanon and deploring civilian loss. This is an archival anchor, requiring no embellishment. International bodies responded in formal language, attempting to translate a night raid into categories like sovereignty, territorial integrity, and ceasefire obligations. The documentary tone should resist the urge to moralize. The moral ambiguity is already present. Israel's operation was framed by its planners as retaliation and deterrence. Its critics framed it as illegal aggression and slaughter in a residential district. The same raid can be and has been used as proof of resolve by one audience and proof of brutality by another. The dossier's job is not to choose a slogan. It is to show collision between operational intent and human reality. The domestic motif appears again as contrast. Funeral crowds in daylight, balconies and streets filled with people, the city reclaiming its public space from secrecy imposed upon it the night before. In daylight, disguises are pointless. In daylight, the event belongs to everyone. The raid was built to be brief, but its public afterlife is long. Funerals are how cities refuse to let violence stay private. When the story moves into international chambers, the same night is retold as either necessity or crime, depending on who is speaking. In the years after April 1973, the Beirut raid remained in public memory as one of the most audacious operations in Israel's broader campaign of targeted killings associated with Munich's aftermath. Official summaries continued to describe operational success. Journalistic reconstructions continued to foreground the disguise and residential setting. Regional histories continued to treat the raid as part of the chain of escalation that made Lebanon a persistent arena for proxy conflict. What can be verified is that key commanders associated with the raid, most notably Ehud Barak, who would later become prime minister, spoke publicly about the disguise element, describing wigs and makeup as practical concealment. What cannot be responsibly claimed without specific testimony is private psychological damage. The dossier should not invent remorse in a man who did not record it. Instead, it should show the quieter, more documentable truth. The operation became narratable. It became something that could be told on television, summarized in official timelines, taught as audacity. And yet the international record, UN condemnation, Lebanese protest sits alongside the operational narrative, reminding the viewer that audacity is not a synonym for legitimacy. The dead remain dead regardless of which institution tells the story more cleanly. The domestic motif completes its transformation. In the beginning, it was just preparation. Hair adjusted, clothes arranged, a face made plausible. In the end, it is artifact, an object lesson in how easily the ordinary can be weaponized. A wig is not inherently sinister, but in this file, it becomes symbol of the entire method. becoming harmless-looking long enough to do harm. The final echo should not be a thesis. It should be an image that mirrors the opening, a quiet street, a reflective pane of glass, and a figure who once used that reflection as camouflage. And somewhere in Verdun, the balconies face the same streetlight, empty, intact, and permanently aware that ordinary can be borrowed for violence.